Well, hello there. Thanks for joining me. I am Dr. Jen, and I'm so pleased you joined me for today's show. As a real estate investor, owner, operator, self-managing rental manager, or any or all of these may apply to you, what's your most important commodity? Is it money or is it time? Well, I think there's an argument to be made both ways, but at the moment, I think it's time. Today's episode is what do you do when your permit gets stuck? What to do when your permit gets stuck. That's right, when it gets stuck. Unless you live in a super business friendly place, such as different areas of Texas, or maybe in certain regional districts of British Columbia, you will likely have a delay of some kind when getting a building permit. And worst of all, you may not have any control of it at all. What do you do? So let's talk about today, what do you do when your permit gets stuck? Specifically, what kind of what kind of permits are we talking about? How do you know your permit is stuck? Where it is stuck, figuring out where it's even at, and then what do you do ultimately to get it approved? Okay, let's talk numbers first, and let's do some nerdy stuff all about permits. I'm going to talk about permits in the US and permits in Canada. This is the fun stuff that I like. So I Googled building permit statistics US 2024. And from census.gov, there is a HUD and Census Bureau report. In fact, I found that they release them monthly, a new residential construction report, which goes out every 18th of every month. And so for September 2024, 1,428,000 building permits were issued in the US, including 1,354,000 housing starts in the US, and completions was 1,686,000 housing completions. So what does this mean in English? Issued building permits in the US were down 2.9% in September from the month before in August, and down 5.7% from the year before in September of 2023. Housing starts were also down less than 1% compared to the month and year prior. Housing completions are also down. We'll talk about why that is, but let's talk timing. I Googled average time to get a building permit in the US 2024. The website homeguide.com popped up and said 2 weeks. 2 weeks was the national average for a building permit to be reviewed and issued in the United States. The typical cost for a building permit in the US ranges from $457 to almost $3,000, with the national average at $1,638. This is from Angie.com. And I found other sites like housingrail.com that said the average cost of a permit nationally was around $1,300. So it's very geographic dependent, as is your wait times. Longest wait times to get a building permit in the US. Honolulu is number 1, San Francisco, and Maui. Maui is on page 1 of the Google result, and the permitplace.com has a list of permit review times for top cities across the US, including California, Washington State, Nevada, Arizona, Texas, and Florida. And then you can search for major metro areas in those states to find out the average building permit wait time. Reported wait time as of 1 year ago for commercial building permit in Honolulu is nearly 1 year. So folks who applied to get a permit in October of 2023, according to civilbeat.org, would now just be getting that permit. Residential permits in Honolulu are taking about 6 months to review and approve. Right now on Maui, building permit time, according to my favorite organization here in Hawaii, University of Hawaii Economic Research Organization, known as UHERO, Hawaii's the county of Maui average building permit wait time is currently 400 days. 400 days. So the national average is 2 weeks. Maui, it's 13 months. And by the way, when I Googled the shortest time to get a building permit in the US, a number of Texas locations popped up, all stating approximately 1 month or shorter. But because I have family members living in the San Antonio area, I can attest that parts of that area issue residential building permits in 1 week or less, and a commercial building permit in approximately 2 weeks. Wow. So that's the US. Let's do the Canadian side. So I Googled the same thing. I Googled Building Permit Statistics Canada 2024, and what popped up from Statistics Canada dated August 12th, 2024, the total value of building permits in Canada fell by almost 14% to $10 billion. That's with a B. Decreases were reported in 11 of the 13 provinces and territories, with both residential and non-residential sectors experiencing reductions. Total value of building permits declined 14.3% in June of 2024, following a 13.4% decline in May 2024. And this is tough stuff. Building permits are down. We can likely guess why. Money seems to be more expensive with the interest rates higher, even with Bank of Canada dropping them. The cost of money, inflation on everything else, the cost of money is very likely the easiest to blame for this, especially when you're thinking about the hold times waiting for all of these building permits to get reviewed. It doesn't matter if you're in US or Canada, you're still paying for all that time. And especially if you've purchased a property with hard money, you're paying high interest rates the entire time you're waiting. So the cost of money is very likely this. So if you want to see where I got all these statistics, you go to Statistics Canada, www.150.statcan.gc.ca. Canadian Real Estate Magazine reported that interesting points that permits for multifamily buildings have hit unprecedented high levels. Single-family housing permits are at 40-year lows. Let me say that again. Multifamily building permits have hit unprecedented high levels. Single-family housing permits are at 40-year lows. So apartment buildings are going up all over the place. I know there's one that's about to have occupancy in Paul River. I know there's all kinds going up in Vancouver, Surrey, and lots of other places. I'm guessing if you're listening to this in Canada, there are multifamily units going up where you are, and probably, if I had to guess, not so many single-family homes and or subdivisions. I did search the average time to get a building permit in Canada, and Google search engine could not produce a result for me. It was stuck on the statistics of the building permits issued, which is interesting. So I don't have any time to report average time like I do for the States. But let's talk about what kind of permits we're talking about here. What kind of permits are we even discussing? I need to make a specific note on this because I'm recording this on Maui following the wildfires that burned homes in both Kula and burned homes and took the life of over 100 people in our beloved Lahaina. So there is something new on Maui regarding permitting, and that is something called a temporary building permit. And this is helping the Lahaina homeowners live on their land while they're applying for building permits to put a permanent structure there. So these are items that will be up for a relatively short amount of time. So this may or may not apply to you in your specific area, but primarily what I referenced today applies for permits of permanent improvements, not necessarily temporary. But I must put a caveat in there that temporary building permits is a thing now, which it never used to be. So what kind of permanent permits? Well, it depends on the geographic location that you're in. If you're in a city, then you would need to call the city about what you want to build or what you want to demolish. Yes, usually you need a permit for any kind of change and improvement, whether you're adding to it, you're subtracting to it, or it's a safety item. You've got to make sure you understand the permits that are involved in the entire thing, start to finish. If you're in a regional district or a county or a parish, but not in a city, then you would talk with your local governing office. And this is actually really easy to figure out who to call. It's who you pay your property taxes for that property. That's who you call. So find your old property tax bill for your most recent tax year, and there'll be contact information there. Just pick up the phone and call them, tell them what you want to do, and they will walk you through it, or they'll tell you who to call, which is good. Okay, so because they're collecting money on the land, the overall improvements, they're going to be very interested in that, because as soon as you make the improvement, good or bad, whether you're taking stuff away or you're adding to it, they're going to want their tax money for the change. So they're going to want you to do whatever it is you're going to want to do. So what kind of permits would this governing body have? It depends on their bylaws, which is super geographic specific. So I'm going to go through a bunch of them here. You need to call your local office to find out what's specific to you. Here are some of the permits that you could be applying for and or waiting on. So we'll start with the big three. This is the big three that anytime we're talking about housing, this is what comes up: water, wastewater, and power. So water, whether it's well drilling, tying into or adding a meter from your local community and or your public water system, could be from your private water system if you are in a subdivision that has a dedicated well, but anything regarding water typically involves the Department of Health. There will be a health involvement, health inspector somewhere in there. Same with septic system approval or wastewater. If you're on a larger community system, whether it's a public system or a private system, chances are the health inspector is going to want a permit and or testing before you tie in. Power. If you're tying into the electrical grid, which often involves getting a meter, this also involves typically getting a civil address or a house meter, as most of the time the power company issues the civil addresses. It's pretty interesting how you find these things out, but you're usually going to need power. And if you need power, even temporary power while you build your structure, the electric company is typically going to want to know the building permit number that you're working off of. They're not just going to give you power just randomly, and they're probably not going to give you power just because you ask. It's going to be interesting. Now, what about other permits, especially regarding other safety items, especially as you build? So your electrical permits are different than your building permits. Your electrician usually will pull this. Even if you're off grid, you need to check your local safety area. Your insurance may want you to have a permit, whether it's for a house, off-grid, solar, however it is. If it's an improvement, typically you're going to need to check if you need a permit or not for your local area. Same with solar. If you're going to add solar or PV, you need to make sure you're aware of it, because if they catch you and you are not permitted properly, or your insurance company doesn't audit and you're not permitted properly, this could be an issue. So you need to make sure you are following all of the proper protocol for the permits in your area. Regarding power, same with mechanical permit. Now, sometimes when I talk about mechanical stuff, that's not necessarily for a house. This is typically for a commercial permit, especially when we're talking safety issues like ducting in an apartment building, but it could be other things. This is something that could come up, and you want to make sure that you are well versed in the permits that you need. What about a gas permit? Your plumber will pull this. Same thing for safety in your local area, and your insurance will likely want a permit on this. And before you can actually get gas, whether it's propane or natural gas, the supplier of that tank, where whoever's going to fill it for you, they're not just going to bring you propane, natural gas, whatever, without a permit. They're not going to just bring it for you and put it in the tank because you say it's okay. You've got to make sure you've got your permit stuff. Same with plumbing. Plumbing permit is still a safety item. Flooding and venting gases is a safety issue. And you also want to know what permits are different between commercial and residential. So your plumber will know all of this, so that's good. Okay, fire. Fire reviewers will usually have a review on all plans. Now, this is not necessarily a specific permit per se, but they have to approve what you want to build, because remember, they may require sprinklers in your home or your business. They may require fire suppression if you have a commercial kitchen. They may require 24-hour monitoring or other requirements, because once you get your occupancy for whatever that is that you're building, whether it's a house or condos or whatever, the local fire station then has to cover the fire protection for that new building as part of their job. So the fire reviewers, even before you build this thing, they want to make sure that they are approving what is getting built. One of the things that you might need is a grading permit. Now, this is something that many locations want, and is usually triggered when a specific amount of ground is disturbed or dug out or has to be filled in. Places like Hawaii, there's also archaeological concerns, not only for burials and culturally sensitive things, but there is also ordnance like unexploded bombs that have been found in places on Maui and also in Kaho'olawe, because the US Navy used those areas for bombing practice for years. In fact, in our most recent condo build in South Kihei, we had to have a study done on what's the likely that there is ordnance, that we would find ordnance when we built Paradise Ridge. And so it's a thing. You have to have coordination. And how would you even know this? Now, because Paradise Ridge is primarily built on blue rock, on volcanic rock, the chances of finding an ordinance was very, very low, and we didn't find anything, but just be aware. But this is also very concerning about archaeological history. If there are burials, or there might, just because the sand, if there's sand on your location, there's sand, there might be burials there. So you've got to really, really know what kind of supporting documents you need. Also water and soils. There is usually a water and conservation review for grading permits, but there can be other things as well. So you want to make sure you understand in your specific area and your specific geologic features that what is required, because if it's very steep granite or shale or whatever it is in your specific area, the topography, your local office may require different things. They may require an engineered retaining wall. That may be a part of some kind of a permit. You may have to have a permit for that. You want to ask all these very specific questions in advance. Don't get yourself into issues before. So grading permit. Then there's something usually called a grubbing permit. And this is usually associated with the grading permit. And it's that top layer of soil. So it's the equivalent of weeding your garden, just pulling out the stuff on the top. And this type of permit is not usually moving soil, but just clearing the very top layer so it's clear. And usually the grading permit and the grubbing permit are together, but they don't have to be. They can be separate. If you are in a area that has a lot of coastal zones, so if you are either on the East Coast, West Coast of Canada or the US, or like in Hawaii, Alaska has a lot of coastal area. There is a federal US program called the Coastal Zone Management that Hawaii has adopted and does enforce. It's a federal zoning aspect that they have to enforce by the maximum extent. And so certain properties within a certain amount of coastline are in a special, what they call a special management area, an SMA, and you have to have an SMA permit to put your building or your improvement in there. You also have to have an SMA permit to even put a sign up. I mean, there's a bunch of stuff you have to do if you are near the coastline. I know this because I did this at Paradise Ridge because we were 1,000 feet from the beach. So unfortunately, the burn areas in Lahaina, a lot of that is within the SMA coastal zone management in Lahaina. And so you have to have not only all of these building permits, but you also then have to have a special management permit to build. Okay, let's see. You have to, yeah, there's special criteria you have to meet for your SMA. And then, so you have to submit before you can actually pull your building permit. SMA has to clear and say, yes, you are what they call pre-compliant. You're pre-compliant for the building permit, which would allow you to actually pull the building permit. And then before they allow you to have occupancy, you have to prove that what you built was compliant with the SMA. And I've done all this, but you have to do this. Otherwise, it doesn't matter. Even if you've gotten all your inspections, you cannot get occupancy if you're in a special management zone without your SMA approval. It's very interesting and very specific. Let's talk demolition for a second. If you have an improvement that must come down, the biggest concern that I have seen, and we have done demolition before, is vermin, rats usually. Usually the biggest concern is when there is an abandoned structure or some kind of structure that must come down. There is usually a person like the health inspector that will confirm that there is some kind of monitoring system in place for vector control. Vector control is basically monitoring the amount of little rodents that are exiting the property and are going to go into the neighboring properties. This is big time. We've done this before. We did this at Paradise Ridge. We've done it one other time. And after the building comes down, the vermin will vacate. They'll go to the neighboring properties. And there can also be issues with aged buildings with hazardous waste items such as asbestos. Now, there are different requirements for taking down a building of certain ages, whether it's the drywall or the tile or whatever it might be. You have to make sure that you are complying with not only taking that building down properly, you have to also ensure that the work is done by a properly licensed or certified body who's doing this. And then whatever the protocols are for actually disposing of the waste, properly in likely the landfill or sometimes an incinerator. You have to make sure you understand the exact way that you have to dispose of this. So demolition of an existing structure is not always what it appears to be. So you've got to be really, really cognizant of the recovery of a demolished structure. Very interesting how this all works. Pool permit. Pool permit to put in a pool or to operate even a public pool, even at a non-public place. There may be triggers that will make the health department get a pool or a spa or a waterfall permit. And how do I know? Because we did this. Even though the condos that we built in South Maui are private and behind two gates, because of a number of users and the amount of units that were built, the Department of Health considered it a public facility, required a permit for the pool, hot tub, and the waterfall feature, and requires daily maintenance. So the homeowners association from here on out will have to pay for daily maintenance and testing and make sure it's completely compliant all the time. Very interesting what triggers what. Then you have fun things like an environmental permit. We saw something like this in British Columbia. So make sure you are cognizant of this. If you've got water flowing at any time on any of your properties or even near your properties. For example, one of our locations in Canada, we were looking to build apartments on, there is a post-winter stream that was considered flowing, quote unquote, flowing by its size. And this triggered an environmental requirement. We had to have a study done to see if this was an impact, to see what the impact of building our building near this stream would have. Ultimately, it was found to be negligible, but we still had to do the study. We still had to pay for the study, and we still had to wait for the study. However, if the stream would have been flowing year-round and or would have been a bigger flow, or if it would have been a fish-bearing stream, the environmental requirements would have been much, much more stringent and may have affected where our building locations could be, our building envelopes. But just be aware of that. If you're in a riparian zone, if this is something that you are even thinking about or curious about, you need to make sure you're doing the right thing, especially in the current code aspect of environmental regulations. And that goes in the US as well. You've got to make sure that you are keenly aware of what you are allowed to build and how close you are allowed to build in any kind of water situation. Air tightness checks. This is something happening in Canada, may not necessarily be on a separate permit, but this is something that is changing building codes to increase health, safety, and well-being. This is from efficiencycanada.org. We've been seeing this in British Columbia, but admittedly, not all of it makes sense to us, because as soon as you make everything airtight and you do an airtight check, that's usually where mold grows, especially in wet climates like the coasts. So it doesn't always make sense, but that's something that's going, and this is why building codes change all the time. One other note, I want to let you know that ultimately, if you're getting into a building permit, quote unquote building permit, it can also be known as a construction permit. So you can hear that interchangeably. I say building permit because that's the terminology that I'm used to. That's what I hear, but I do see in other locations across the states that it is called a construction permit. Okay, so also a couple of things I want to make sure that you are aware. Did you know that you might need a permit if you have a construction site trailer for a larger build, like such for either a subdivision or a tiny home community or building condos? You might need a permit for the temporary construction site trailer. This likely won't apply if you're just building a home, but it is more common if you're building a commercial building or multifamily. But you have to ask permission to put in a site trailer. Again, if you're going to change what you're doing on a property near the coast, it likely has to be noted on your special management area plan. You might also need a permit to install a playground or any kind of playing items, especially if it's part of a commercial application. For example, I'm betting that every McDonald's that has a play place in it very likely has a permit for it and probably has an inspection periodically to make sure there's no safety issues. So just be aware of that. If you're going to add a playground to a multifamily common area complex or something like that. You need to make sure that if you have a playground, what is the requirements? You also want to make sure you're talking to your insurance agent about this, because they're probably going to want to make sure that the permits are in place and that your coverages are proper if and when, hopefully, knock on wood, somebody gets hurt. Hopefully not. So if you've applied for some kind of building permit, whether it's residential, commercial, temporary, or permanent, how do you know your permit is stuck, right? You apply for everything, you do your homework, you've submitted everything, you've got an architect, you do it properly, whatever the governing body tells you need to do. And then what? Well, what happens if nothing happens? And I'm not saying just for a day or even a week, for a while. And you can define a while as much as it is, whether it's a month or sometimes 6 months. If you're lucky enough to have permit status on a software that you can check, something online that you can check, then the software date update or reviewer comments won't change for a while. And if it's stuck, then you might check with whatever the average permit time is in your area. If you're past the average time, your permit might be stuck. But where is it stuck? Okay, so this is where it starts to get interesting, and this is where you have to start to have a bunch of awkward conversations. And this is where I'm going to teach you a little bit about my superpower here. Now, disclaimer, you have to have the right temperament to do this next part. What I'm about to explain is how to walk a very, very fine line between getting your permit to progress towards an approval and making everybody mad. Because if you make everybody mad, they can shove your permit application to the bottom of the stack. This is a very fine line here. And if you lose your temper at any time towards anyone in this entire process, you have lost. You have lost. You cannot lose your temper. If you know you lose your temper, don't do this part, okay? You must speak in facts, and you must be thankful all the time to whoever is trying to help you, whether it's a part of their job or not. This is important. If you cannot do that, then you must not be a part of this process, because all you will do is make a permit even more stuck. It'll take even longer, and whoever you yelled at, belittled, or disrespected, they will remember you. It doesn't matter how big or small your city is or how big or small your population is. They will remember you. That's my disclaimer. People remember how you make them feel. And if you belittle them or make them feel bad, guess what? They're going to remember you. Okay. This is my superpower. I can do this without losing my temper. I'm very happy to speak in facts. And because I have an award-nominated podcast about awkward conversations, I fully realize that speaking in facts and not losing my temper is indeed my superpower, which is why I'm going to try to teach you some of my tricks today in figuring out where your permit is stuck and then what to do. So you have to figure out where the permit is stuck. And if your software is showing different approvals of different departments like water or fire or Department of Health, if they've already approved it, you don't need to approach them, right? You're just looking for the departments who have not approved anything yet, or they haven't given any comments yet. That's where you want to look. How do you connect with them? Now, some of them in your software, if you're lucky enough to have a software, the software might even say who your permit reviewer is. You could call or email them if you have their contact information. Typically, you'll get their contact information, or it's easy to find online just by Googling or going to the local governing body's website. There's usually a website. And if it's not the specific reviewer's contact information, it could be the generic planning department or building permit review. You can somehow get a phone number and or email either for the specific reviewer or that department. So if their contact information isn't listed, then you can try to find it. And then what we say at this point, if your reviewer, might be one of two things. If you start reaching out trying to get a hold of your reviewers, and your reviewer might either reply back by email, or they might call you and say, we responded on such and such a date, we need such and such to change, or these documents before we can approve. Now, here's the trick. Sometimes those emails get lost in translation. You don't know who those emails were sent to. It's usually whoever applied for the permit. Most of the time it's an architect. It doesn't have to be the architect, but most of the time it is the architect. So if the architect never got this email back from the reviewer and has no idea that the reviewer has got comments, then you need to follow up. You, as the owner, need to follow up with the architect and say, hey, this reviewer said this, this, and this. What's the status? And the architect will come back and say, I didn't get that information. Oh boy. So then they can now resubmit, which is good. So they also may have had a bad email. Maybe the reviewer responded and they were off by a letter and the architect legitimately never got anything, or it went to the spam folder. You know how that goes. But the real power in tracking down where permits are stuck is with you, the owner. It's not typically with the architect. It's not usually with the contractor or a consultant who is also known as an agent. I was the agent for Paradise Ridge. It is almost always with the owner. If you are the owner, you have the most power when you are applying for permits. You're also the most liable because this is all on you. You've hired the architect, you've got the drawings, it's all on you, which is a good thing. You want to leverage that to try to figure out how to get your permit approved. Okay, so you go through all of the non-reviewed, no comments, you contacted all reviewers, you are trying to figure out what do you do next. Maybe you can't get responses from one or more of the reviewers. Okay, so how do you figured out where it's stuck in certain different places. So you have to contact the reviewer. If they have an update, they will likely remind you of anything outstanding. But what if they're not responsive? What if you've contacted your reviewer and they're saying, yeah, I've got it as of 2 months ago, it's in the stack, something like that. You could, like I said, you could call the department directly. But here's what happens when you call the department. So let's say you're calling the Department of Water. Okay, let's just say. You will likely have a nice person answer the phone, and I refer to this person as the quote unquote gatekeeper. So you have to figure out how to learn to get as much as you can from this gatekeeper as possible, which usually the gatekeepers are lovely. So and they're usually very up on what's going on. So explain the situation, explain who you are, and that you're trying to get a status from whoever this reviewer is, and there's not been any response for a while. Are they still reviewing your permit? Right? The gatekeeper will likely say one of two things. One, that person doesn't work here anymore, or that person is out on medical leave, right? Or they're very busy and you can leave a message, meaning it's still in queue, right? But just the fact that you're following up, again, as the owner, they will get that message. If the reviewer that your permit was assigned to doesn't work there anymore, or they're out on medical leave, which has happened to me multiple times, you can ask the nice gatekeeper who you could talk to about getting an update about the review status of your permit, and then be silent for a while they figure out how to handle your request. Just let them figure it out. If the gatekeeper says the reviewer of your permit is too busy and they'll leave a message, you can leave a message, but then ask the gatekeeper, how can I get on the reviewer's calendar? I'm available to speak by phone, right? How can I get on their calendar? Now, typically it takes multiple calls to actually get on their calendar. So I will tell you this, that you can ask the gatekeeper to try to get on their calendar, or they'll transfer you to the reviewer's voicemail and you can leave a voicemail. There's a couple different things here. The key here is the gatekeeper can simply leave your reviewer a message and move on. But if the gatekeeper also keeps the reviewer's calendar, your kind demeanor just may get you a spot on the calendar. And typically what happens when you get on their calendar, because this has happened to me many times, when an appointment is made, that reviewer will do everything possible to get you a status update before the appointment so they don't actually have to have the call. They don't want to have the call. They're too busy. So this will usually prompt a call. It'll usually prompt an email. This calendar appointment will usually nudge them to get you a status update. It can usually bring your permit to the top, maybe, but there is also another way you could play this, especially if you are in the physical location where your permit is getting reviewed. The most effective way to get a status update I have ever seen is to walk into that department in person as the owner and ask to see the reviewer in person. You will likely be talking directly to the same gatekeeper that you've been talking about. You'll see them scramble. And again, you want to thank them for their help in this. And the question again in person is, how do I get on my reviewer's calendar? and just simply sit there and wait. This is very effective, but you must walk this line very nicely. You don't want to overdo it. You don't want to be nasty. This is the key here. This is why you can't lose your temper, because the reviewer may be in meetings, right? You're walking in completely unannounced. The reviewer may not be available to even see you. They may not be available to schedule an appointment. But the fact that you are in the office as an owner is very telling. It's very powerful. It's realistic. And if you're nice, it's reasonable. And that's how you can get your permit to move. I've been incredibly effective at this, especially when I had a question that I could not get answered. I would simply get in my car in my high-vis shirt and my steel-toed boots, and I would drive to whatever department I needed here on Maui, and I would walk in and just talk to the gatekeeper and say, I have a question, or I need to get on this person's calendar. I can't seem to get them on phone or email. This is very important. How do I get on their calendar? And I just sit and wait. And the longer you wait, the more awkward it is for them. And like I said, you will very likely get a calendar appointment, and likely whoever it is you're trying to get an appointment with about a reviewer update, a building permit status, or just a question in general, it will usually work very quickly, because again, that reviewer does not want to have this appointment. They want to get you what you need so they can cancel that time. Okay, there you go. There's one of my superpowers. I actually have a couple of permits in review right now, and they're stuck because everyone globally, unfortunately, happens to be short-staffed. And right here on Maui, the demand for permits is super high. And the new software system called Bluebeam, not everywhere uses this, but it is called Bluebeam here. It was unveiled a few years back, and there's still a gigantic learning curve going on, not just from the users, the owners, the architects, but also from the reviewers. It's really kind of sad of how much it's a very difficult, complex program that you can review things electronically. But thankfully, we're not doing it by hand anymore. Usually we had these great big scrolls of paper, and you had to do all kinds of reviews by hand. We're not doing them by hand anymore, but that doesn't mean it's easier or better. Okay, so here's the trick. You want to find out where your permit is stuck. And the sooner you figure out where it is stuck, who it's stuck with, my famous question for getting permits unstuck is very simple. Educate me on what is next. That's it. Educate me on what's next. If the reviewer says, I just need to review it again, then my next sentence is, what do you need from me to support your review? That's it. What do you need from me to support your review? Is it an email? Is it a check? Is it a letter? Is it a revision? Is it a phone call with the architect? What is it? One of my other famous lines that I love to include is, please know this permit approval is my #1 priority. So if you need anything at all, call me immediately. I will drop everything and support what you need. Because when the reviewer knows that you are waiting and that you are ready to support, it changes their mindset. They know that they're making me wait. And as an owner, especially as an owner, this is really important. So I wanted to make sure that you understand this. So these are the words that I use. Now, this might be intense for some people, but when you're paying high interest payments on maybe a private money loan on vacant land that you can't build yet, every month, the intensity goes up as your as your bank account balance goes down. So is this intense? Yeah, it is intense, which is why real estate, contracting, rental management, permits are not for everyone. And honestly, that's okay. But there's an insight into some of my superpowers on how I get permits unstuck. There you go. I shared you some nerdy statistics about the permits in the US and Canada. I talked about what kinds of permits get stuck, what to do when they get stuck, figuring out where it is stuck, and then ultimately trying to get an approval. Just keep in mind, it takes a certain temperament to get permits unstuck and to get them approved. Your call to action today is very simple. If you have a stuck permit, do you have the temperament to get it unstuck, or do you need to hire someone to get it unstuck for you? Thanks for joining me on today's show.